All right, as we begin studying the embryonic development of different kinds of vertebrate organisms, it's important to know where we're going here. Each of our different animal groups that we will look at will go through these stages of progression. Everything will begin as a zygote, a single cell. The first stage of development, when cells start to divide, these are called cleavage stages. So we go through a number of cleavage stages. Often just described as one cell stage, two cell stage, two cell stage, four cell stage, 8 cell stage, and so on, as each cell divides into two. So cleavage stages just mean they divide. That leads to what's called a blastula stage of development, where there's a hollow cavity that forms in the developing embryo. It's not a solid mass of cells any longer, just goes from being a clump of cells to being a clump of cells with a hollow space inside. And eventually then the next stage would be gastrula. Gastric is having to do with stomach, so the beginning of the gut formation is seen there in that stage. Also, typically, this is where we see the beginning of our 3 germ layers: ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm come from that stage of development. Now, we'll take our examples at least through the gastrula stage, the beginning of the formation of the gut, and the germ layers in each example. The first example, the Amphioxus, will only take it to a limited extent into its development there. Won't go very far into the formation of other organs and such. The frog will take a little bit further, then we'll talk about bird embryos and then mammalian embryos. So we have 4 different groups to get through, and so we're going to start with the Amphioxus. So, first of all, the Amphioxus. It has a very, very small egg. It's what we call microlecithal, very small, and it also has a uniform distribution of yolk. We're going to draw the egg cell fairly large here because we want to show how, as it divides, the cells get smaller and smaller. We want to end up with an embryo about this size in my last drawing here. So inside there's a nucleus in there that's going to divide and lead to the first division. So this is our zygote, our fertilized egg cell here. So it's going to undergo that first division to form 2 cells. There's our 2-cell stage, the first stage in the cleavage stages. Next would be a 4-cell stage. Now these cells are not feeding, they're not able to grow any, so when they undergo division, each cell is half as big as the one that preceded it. Then you have an 8-cell stage. Next would be a 16-cell stage. So here we are at the 16-cell stage, and then a 32-cell stage. And at this stage, we're going to identify this as a morula. Morula from a term meaning like a berry, like a raspberry or blackberry kind of arrangement, made up of a cluster of cells in this case. So anyway, these are the cleavage stages: 2 cell, 4 cell, 8 cell, 16, and up to the morula. This is our last in the cleavage stage events. The next event in here is the formation of that open space inside this mass of cells. So we're going to end up with, if we looked inside, as this tends to form the cavity in the inside here, we'd have a ring of cells. If we were to cut through that mass of cells, cut through it, we'd see that space on the inside of the cell cluster. So this is our early blastula. Following the morula stage of development. It continues to see cell division, so we get a more extreme version of that hollow ball, and just lots more cells going on there. And this is the late blastula. And the next event we're going to see here is a caving in of one end of that blastula. By the way, this cavity on the inside is referred to as a blastocele. And as long as it persists, that's the name that will be applied to it there. So this structure caves in on one side, and this end here this infolding, we mentioned this earlier when we were talking about protostomes and deuterostomes. But anyway, this is where the gut begins to form, that infolding right there. And that infolding is going to become known as the blastopore. The blastocele is still this cavity here, and the gut is going to form there. And this is the earliest stage we know as a gastrula. So this is an early gastrula. Early gastrula stage. Okay, I've moved my camera now, so we're going to show what goes on in the next stage of the gastrula formation. I'm now going to go from having just all my cells being the same color here. I'm going to make the outside layer blue. So here's a blue layer of cells. These cells divide and divide and divide and divide, so that there's a lot of cells at this point. And then there's an inner layer of cells that continues from that makes a long pocket back into the embryo. Try to draw that again. There's the beginning of ectoderm and endoderm, the blue being ectoderm on the outside of the body and forming the gut tube in here. Aligning that is the endoderm in orange in the picture. Let's see, we need to label those things. Ectoderm and then endoderm. That was our blastocele opening back here in the back, but this cavity right here that forms that long tube-like passage is the gastrocele, also known as the primitive gut. and sometimes called the archenteron, A-R-C-H-E-N-T-E-R-E-R-O-N, archenteron, archenteron. All of those names apply to this same space right here that continues from the blastopore opening down through the embryo. Since this is a deuterostome organism, it's an Amphioxus, eventually that tube will go through all the way to form a mouth at the opposite end over here. Now, mesoderm is going to fill in between the endoderm and the ectoderm in this area, the area we now have referred to as the blastocele space out here. That's going to fill in with mesoderm as this animal develops, form a mesodermal region in here. And along the very mid-dorsal portion of the embryo here, we're going to have the neural tube eventually form. The nervous system will form right down the dorsal portion of that. The mesoderm that's found just beneath that nerve tissue will become the notochordal tissue of the Amphioxus. So those events will be happening in there to carry us on a little bit further. But for the Amphioxus, this is as far as we need to carry it right now. We started with a zygote, a fertilized egg, then we went through the cleavage stages, and then eventually into the blastula and then gastrula stages of development. So this is a late gastrula with the gut tube pretty well formed, ectoderm and endoderm layers, and we'll see the beginning of mesoderm come off in here. It's a little hard to illustrate how that happens in a longitudinal cut of the animal, but anyway. That's the beginning of Amphioxus. Next will be the frog.